first thing that we have to do is identify the elephant in the room, which is the gap between medical coders and CDI specialists. Now, because I've done podcast episodes and talk with a lot of professionals and network with a lot of professionals, especially on LinkedIn, on my social media groups, as mentioned, Medical Coding Geeks and the CDI network, you get an insight as to the relationships between medical coding and CDI. So this presentation, of course, is just to give you more insight. But of course, before I even start that, I do want to, of course, celebrate this week. It is CDI week, and thank you guys for having me. And hopefully everybody is ending off this week, celebrating clinical documentation integrity. And with the theme, I guess the theme is a movie theme, right? So I figured when I was preparing this presentation, you know what? Let me give you guys a story, right? But if you want to put it into professional context, a case study, right? And the case study is me, because when I want to share some of the insights on how to bridge the medical coding and CDI gap, I think the best way to explain it is how I did it. And hopefully, and also I garnered some crowdsourcing information to share what other people in the spectrum of CDI and medical coding, what are they doing? Okay, so of course our objectives, again, thank you guys for having me. We're going to talk about, of course, the gap, the elephant in the room. I'm going to give you guys insights about myself and really just share with you with my CDI journey, but really specifically, not so much how I figured it out, but really how I bridged the gap between becoming a CDI and working with inpatient coding. After that, we're going to talk about some of the best practices that will be shared by some of the colleagues that I crowdsourced in my medical coding geeks and the CDI network group. So let's start off with the story, the film, the movie, right? Since this is a movie theme for CDI week. So let me show you guys a timeline. I'm not going to go through this entire timeline. As mentioned before in the introduction, I have my bachelor's in HIM. My first job after getting my degree was working as a HIM technician in South Florida. After that, I obtained my RHIA, but most specifically within the bolded text that you see here, I obtained my RHIA. After that, I felt like I could conquer the world, so to speak, and I applied to different positions, but one position that really stood out was becoming an HIM director right out of school, but specifically for a 5-facility jail system. Right then and there, I spent a year and then became a CDI specialist. After that, then the rest is history. Became a CDIP, podcaster, and now speaker. So, the journey here is great, but specifically, I want to talk about really between 2005 and maybe around 2006 to 2008 or 9. Okay. So back in 2005, I was the HIM technician. Okay, and this is when during a time that I used to work in the hospital, and a specific consulting company came to our department, our HIM department, proposing clinical documentation improvement. That's what it was called back in the time. And they came to do an audit of our records, and after the audit, they did a full report with the HIM team, administration, and of course, the medical coding team. So the first way I understood CDI, I'm like, what's that? Back in 2005, what is clinical documentation improvement? And based upon the people that I tried to speak with, the medical coders, my manager, even the consulting team, I was trying to overhear what they're doing as I'm doing my HIM technician work, picking up medical records and getting them ready to be scanned. The first way I understood CDI, clinical documentation improvement, was they wanted nurses and medical coders to work together and review medical records to identify opportunities to update codes that were not reported. So this is my initial, I guess, understanding back in 2005. But the first thing that I noticed immediately when the consultants came and then when they were talking with the medical coders was the fact that they were like this. They had their arms crossed. As I was sitting there watching them, I'm like, what's going on here? And I first noticed that there were disagreements from the consultants and the senior coders. Maybe because that, CDI was very much a new concept to them, and the fact that they're coming in and say, well, we're doing this review while the patient is still in the hospital, or even to the fact that they're doing a retrospective audit and see opportunities where if there are clinical indicators present, but the documentation is not present, or even to the other fact where there is documentation, but it's not clinically present. And so those findings that the consultants brought forward to the medical coding of the HAM team, it wasn't really well received based upon what I've observed. So the only term that I heard was, let's agree to disagree. And I figured, boy, is that what CDI, being a CDI specialist, is all about? A lot of disagreements between this CDI team that they're trying to propose for this healthcare system and the medical coding team disagreeing most of the time, or somehow there's going to be some gray areas, and it's going to be by a case study to try to figure out who's right and who's wrong. And then since then, I'm like, that being a CDI specialist, not for me. And really, to tell you the truth, when I graduated or while I was in school for medical records or health information management, I figured I already made this decision that coding was not for me. And I figured, you know what, my eyes are on health information technology, electronic health records, and I left to become an HIM director. So it's funny to say that, but now look where I am, okay? So I spent a year as a director. Long story short, I fixed a lot of the problems that they had. And you could hear this in one of the episodes that I have in my podcast, specifically with Jordan Johnson. I said in that episode, I fixed all the problems, but the organization was not ready to move forward after the fact that I fixed the problems. So the stuff that they were doing didn't really progress to what I wanted to go forward to. But during that time, I got a call back from the previous facility that I work with. Actually, the healthcare system called me back, and they reached out to me, letting me know that there was a CDI specialist opening at one of their bigger facilities. Of course, they offered better pay, they offered a sign-on bonus, but even so, when I left, to become an HIM director, I still had that bad taste in my mouth. and I asked the HR specialist, I'm like, are you sure? Are you sure you want me? First of all, I don't have any coding experience. Number one, I don't like coding. Number two, I am not a nurse, because that's the initial impression that I had going into being a CDI specialist. Even looking at the job description, you see the term nursing, and automatically I canceled myself out of that running, and I'm like, I'm not qualified for this. However, they said something that really struck, that really got my attention, and they said, we'll train you. I'm like, really? I'm like, okay. And I guess the point of this is that if you are given an opportunity to do something that you don't like, I highly suggest you do it, because then I ask myself, why not? Why not? Why can't I do CDI? Why shouldn't I do CDI? What's the worst thing that can happen? And I knew the bad taste was the fact that I know I'm going to have some disagreements with medical coders, but I figured there has to be a way of figuring out that process. But there's so much more when I approached CDI. I knew coming into the position that there was a big learning curve. So of course, coming into the position, we're going to talk about identifying the gap, the elephant in the room. But really, the gap, I'm going to share with you my personal experience and what I identified as what was the gap. Really coming in with really minimal coding experience, really just the basic college level coding, coming in with very bare minimum of clinical experience. The only term I knew was ACDIS, inflammation, and that was really it. It was really tough. So as I mentioned, it was a tough hill to climb. It was a very, very steep learning curve, literally to the point that it's not like, you know, when you're climbing a mountain, it's going this way. It was more of me climbing up the other way, and the cliff was way out of reach to me, and the curve had to be really acquired really fast. So within the first few years as a CDI, I had to learn both the medical coding aspect. I had to learn also the CDI aspect, but specifically with the medical coding, I figured in my head, you know, because I, not that the fact that I found medical coding tough, I found that there was so much to try and understand, and the only way for me to understand it is the best way of me learning is doing the job while it's in front of me, you know, doing the work as I'm doing it, so that way I can learn it better. When I came in, I had no understanding of diagnosis-related groups. I was with the training team that was teaching me about this, and everything was just going from one aspect to the other, one end to the other. I'm like, what is this DRGs? What are CCs and MCCs? Well, back then when I first started, it was just CCs. I had to relearn and revisit anatomy, pathophysiology, pharmacology, medical records. I knew what medical records were from an HIM technician standpoint, but I didn't know it from a clinical standpoint, how to navigate the medical record, to find the actual clinical evidence, to seek out opportunities for queries or even physician education opportunities. And also, I didn't know the CDI program. I didn't know what it involved. I only knew my process. I didn't know about case creation, case follow-up, query creation, how to write a nice query for the physician, and most importantly, the follow-up, you know, which is, to me, the real work of it all. Is even though you place the query, you got to get the physician to see it, understand it, and then answer it appropriately and compliantly. But the biggest gap, really, all of the stuff that I've mentioned here was of course expected, but what was really unexpected to me at the time when I first started CDI was the reconciliation process. So for those that don't understand the reconciliation process, and this is how, you know, this is me, this is the coders telling me, hey, you got this wrong in an email, and me yelling back. I'm like, what does that mean? And so most of the communication was done through email, but you know, and I'm going to talk about it later how I bridged that gap. But with the reconciliation process, that's the point where I had to deal with the medical coding staff. So for those that, I guess, in terms of reconciliation, that's where I complete my case with the CDI. Since the cases were done concurrently, the patient was discharged, then the case goes over to the medical coding staff. They code it based upon what they think, based upon their review. And of course, if there was any discrepancy, if my query was agreed, disagreed, but most importantly, the gap that I saw is if the coder agreed with what I had, agreed with the query, agreed with the answer that the physician had, and also the coding aspect. But the one that really took me was the coder disagreement with clinical documentation improvement. And in my first years as a CDI, they disagreed with me a ton, a lot in the beginning, and it was tough. And when you first start out as a CDI, really as green as me, it can take a toll to the point where, like, did I make the right decision to do CDI? So this was me every day, every morning, get an email. Brian, could you please check out this coder disagreement, please? And I would just hit my head on the on the keyboard. And because of the disagreements, they affected my KPI, of course, within the first few years, as they told me coming in, okay, we'll train you, but of course, they'll give me time to develop a certain understanding of what I'm doing. And so, which was expected. However, my manager, who was great, also expected me to lower my coding disagreement rate. Okay, so the way the program was set up, it's all about DRGs, how it follows through, making sure that you have the full spectrum of CDI and even flowing into coding. So there was a couple disagreements in terms of my final DRG assignment, may it be in the principal diagnosis, may it be in the secondary diagnosis, but at the time it was a lot of CCs. The MSDRG system back in 2005 didn't really roll out until later, and of course SOI APR DRGs didn't roll out till definitely by then later, but mostly it was just a struggle between just the DRG system and complications of comorbidities, and of course the procedures. I mean, again, trying to figure out operative reports on the fly, figuring out how it can be done was a process for me. And of course, that's an entire presentation on how I figured that out. But really, again, today is all about identifying the gap. But that's what it is. The gap for me was that here's my understanding, here's the coder's understanding of coding. And the way I had to tackle this problem for me, for myself, was that I'm learning the CDI aspect, and that's a totally different issue, right? And I could talk another hour about trying to fix and understand how I learned clinical documentation within the whole 12 years as me as working as a CDI. But really, when I look at the gap between trying to make everything flow through, because the way I see trying to understand CDI as a holistic view is that, of course, we have the CDI aspect, but once it reaches to the point of coding, if there is a blockage, that to me, it doesn't sit well with me. And I have to make sure that blockage is out of the way so that way it can flow through into the revenue cycle process. So these disagreements, for me, it took a toll because I'm like, I'm not getting it right. As I mentioned before, I questioned myself, did I make a right decision in becoming a CDI? I know I'm with a great organization, but did I make a mistake? But then later on, I figured, and seeing how the industry was, and you see it a lot of talk, especially on LinkedIn. And when ACDIS came about, I'm like, well, this seems pretty serious, and so I need to jump on the board and make it work for me, because if I can make CDI work for me, I'm sure there's a lot of opportunities that can open for me if I stick with it. So I figured I had to do something. I had to do something with the medical coding team. And so this was a time when the medical coders were still working on site. So to give you an idea of the electronic health record standpoint, they were scanning the medical records and putting it into the system. So progress notes were written, orders were written, labs and radiology dictations were available, and so basically they can go home. But the coders that were there, they were in not really in a cubicle, but they were in an area. So an area with like about, I like to say, 6 tables, six desks, and they were all there, inpatient coders, all in one area. And combined alone, I mean, each and every one of them had about at least 20 to 30 years of experience. So when I looked at that, and you hear it, and I try to get to know them, I figured they have a lot of knowledge that I need to tap into. I need to tap into that knowledge so that way I can figure out what I'm doing wrong and fix all the problems and then move forward. Okay, so I need to gain understanding what I was doing wrong, learn how I could prevent the mistakes I was making, and specifically, they were initially coding assignment errors. Those can be fixed easily, DRG assignment errors, but most importantly, the coding clinic and the coding guidelines. Those are the two things that I didn't really get a grasp, because of course I'm trying to learn everything all at once. But really, if I figured out those two things, everything else can kind of fall into place, right? So what I did was, give me a second here. What I did was, hold on, I think I have the wrong notes here. Oh, yes. Okay, there we go. So what I did in the way that the department was set up, I come in through the door, and the first people that I meet or the inpatient coders, aside from the release of information. I had to go to release of information, and then I meet the medical coders. And every morning, I made sure the first thing I had to do was say good morning. I said, good morning, ladies. And then the ladies said, good morning, Brian, all in unison every time. It was great. And of course, I always made them laugh. I always had great conversation with them. I shared we shared each other's personal lives. I always asked, how's your family? How's your grandchildren? How's your husband? How's your this? How's your that? What's going on? What did you do this weekend? Right? So that way they knew that I wasn't separated from them, because the way the CDI department was structured, CDI was under HIM, and of course we had to be teamed up within the same department with medical coding. So I had to break down that wall. I had to do the icebreaker. I had to go out there, say good morning. They never said good morning to me, so I said, I'm just gonna go out there and make the effort to go out there and say hello. First of all, say hello every morning. Have conversation, and within the conversation, that's where I kind of squeeze in, like, hey, I know I got this email. It became business. I got this. Could you kind of give me the insight, what I did or what happened here? It may be you may be, the coder may be wrong, or I may be wrong. What is that I need to do to fix the issue? Okay. And in the same regard, while they saw me having conversation with the coders, I was actually pulling other CDIs as they were coming in. Hey, come here. Hey, have you talked to so and so? And really, we started to connect. We started to click. We started to gel. And because of that, that's where the disconnect became really more of a connection at that point. But in the same regard as in regards to speaking with the coders, trying to share what I knew about CDI and what they knew about medical coding, I shared what I knew at the time as I was learning, because they themselves did not understand the process of CDI, because the time that I came in, it was a very early program. It was only a year out that the program at this facility was rolled out. So even the coders, they didn't understand. So anytime they had a question about CDI, about the process, how it works, the workflow, I was willing to answer it every morning that I came in. But they also had concerns, some concerns that I tried to address. If I couldn't, they got to talk to management. Why are the CDIs mostly nurses? Did they get starting higher? Did they have a higher pay than them? How come they're having a hard time understanding medical coding and you're not? And I think maybe because we need to have a collaboration, because at the time they didn't have any case studies, they had separate meetings, everything was separate. And they had within that first year of that program, they were concerned that the CDIs were going to take their job. And I try to assure them, based upon what I did and what I knew in CDI workflows, that that's not the case. We need you in our team. We need to. Well, for me, I need you to help me understand coding, so that way I can understand CDI better. So there was a point, so of course I developed those relationships, and that was ongoing. And it was a certain point in my CDI time that my manager, who oversaw medical coding and CDI, there was at the time a great need, in terms of a backflow in inpatient coding, and rather outsource, they decided, hey, can we get 1 or 2 CDI specialists to do inpatient coding? And immediately I jumped on the opportunity, because I figured if I step away a little bit from CDI and do this inpatient coding thing, I think it can help me better understand the full process. I had a good understanding from the CDI workflow, but I didn't understand the medical coding process. I only knew what I knew from what I did in CDI, DRGs, principal diagnosis, secondary diagnosis, principal diagnosis. And I volunteered immediately. I was one of the first ones. I said, I'll do it. I will do it. And eventually, ultimately, I was the only one who volunteered because all the other CDIs who were nurses, they were really intimidated by the inpatient coding process. And I figured, they said, I could never do that. I'm good with where I'm at. I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna try this out. I'm gonna share with you, what I find on the other side of the fence, and I'm willing to share what's going on. That's the idea, is that there's a gap. There shouldn't be a gap. You have to share what's happening on every side. There needs to be a bit of transparency on both sides. So the process, of course, I was mentored by a lead coder who reviewed every single medical record that I coded. She reviewed every medical code that I assigned. If there was one code that was off, I had to fix it. I had to go there and find it and recode it or remove it, review the guideline, review the code, the coding clinic, etc. And that helped me gain exposure to a wide variety of medical record cases, not just the one I was doing, med surg. I was doing trauma, open heart, vascular cases, oncology, but this even opened me up to newborn, obstetrics, psychology, psychiatry, even rehab. Inpatient rehab back in the day was not a consideration in CDI, but I had exposure to that. I had exposure to the guidelines that are applicable to those specific specialties. And that helped me widen my understanding of the CDI and medical coding process. And I think that is important. If we understand each other's processes, and I'll talk about that in the best practices, it'll make sense. It'll make sense and it'll help bridge that gap. And of course, while I was working with inpatient coders, I developed a deeper relationship. And what happened is that when I finally transitioned from inpatient coding back to CDI, they finally went back home. And so when they went home, they needed help setting up their computers, their laptops, their monitors, their dual screens. And so, my manager saw that I have a good relationship with the medical coders, and she gave me the green light to go to their houses because they couldn't get access to IT and help them set up. And each and every one of those coders that I help up gave me food, gave me food, to go home food such as, ribs, macaroni and cheese, collard greens, everything. Even I got Scotch bonnet peppers, and so the fact that I broke down that gap, I'm able to work with the medical coders. And this also applied with physicians too. So if I did it with medical coders, I can do it the same way with the physicians. So because of that, I had the opportunity to understand their workflow, right? And this is some of the stuff that I had to share back with the CDI team, my colleagues. And boy, was it tough. The things that you have to report as an inpatient coder versus a CDI specialist, it's I don't know, it's uncomparable, right? Because I found it harder as a inpatient coder versus a CDI specialist. And because of the rigorous training and mentoring that I got, it helped my CDI process immensely. And the things that you don't have to report as a CDI specialist that medical coders do: admission diagnosis, discharge disposition codes, physician ID codes, every physician that was in that case. And I'm not talking about, a few day cases. You're talking about, I don't know, 30-day cases, all the physicians that were involved. If they had procedures, all the surgeon ID codes, all the procedure dates. And if this was, again, a very extensive case, I had to put for every ICD-10 PCS, well, at the time is ICD-9, ICD-9 code with the procedure date, with the physician ID code. And of course, all the POA indicators I had to do as a medical coder versus the CDI, which were only affected, what affects the DRG. But this case, everything that you code as a medical coder, you have to apply POA indicators. So to say the least, it's a tough job, right? And I could see why, there is a rift between CDI and medical coding because of the workflow. But if either one side understands what they're doing, then that's going to help out a lot. Okay, so I'm going to finish off with this. Is, of course, that's my story. Hopefully you guys like that. Let's talk about some best practices, right? So based upon my experience in trying to bridge the gap between medical coders and CDI specialists, it's to the point that we really gelled together. We worked well together when they were on site. We had a lot of parties. It was great. It was great when everybody was there. And not, when they were off site and we see them again in quarterly meetings, it's like, a big family reunion. And that is the case, is that you need to have understand, or really a sense of family when you're working with each other. And so let me share you some of these best practice that I have. But before that, and I know he's here today, Brian Simpson. If this was an in-person event, I asked you, Brian Simpson, stand up, raise your hand. So I wanted to share one of the best practices that I can figure out is, of course, diversity. Okay. Uh, in order to bridge the gap, I think diversity is great. The fact that before, uh, for me personally, I had a battle with trying to, with even though I had a CDI job position, trying to find another CDI job position was very tough because the requirement for nurses was high, was great. It was mandated that you have to have an RN. And I saw that as like, what's going on here? Am I pigeonholed in my position now? I can't move on to another CDI position, even though I have 9 years of experience. That's when I first started to try 9 years of experience, which led to me to get my CDIP. Even with that, I still had a struggle. Okay. But as a HIM medical coding professional trying to do CDI or actually doing CDI, struggling to get into a CDI job position, it doesn't compare with, with this gentleman, Brian Simpson, who was a respiratory therapist. And if you guys listen to the Not Also Classified podcast, or if you haven't, please do. This is a great episode of how Brian Simpson started out as a respiratory therapist, worked into because of his health, he worked into working in appeals and denials, and he eventually led himself up to working into CDI. And within 3 years, if I remember right, within 3 years, he obtained a slew of credentials. And he's a self-proclaimed CDI geek. He obtained the CCA, CCS, CCSP, CCDS, CCDSO, and also the CRC, the risk adjustment credential, within 3 years, right? So the same way that I had a hill to climb in working with medical coders, he had a hill to climb just trying to appreciate, the fact of doing CDI. And of course, he always had this phrase: one day, one step, one breath at a time. That's how you do it. And if you're trying to tackle the gap between your department's medical coding and CDI, you got to do it one day, one breath, one step at a time. Great story. It's a two-part, so please check that out. So I'm going to share with you some of the crowdsourcing options, crowdsourcing information that I got from two of my Facebook groups. So if you guys are not part of that, you guys can check that out: Medical Coding Geeks, and also the Clinical Documentation Integrity Network, or also known as the CDI Network. And back in July, I think, who was it? It was Janelle Murray. She reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, Brian, can you do a presentation on trying to build relationships between medical coders and CDI? I'm like, sure. Let me go to my groups. And as soon as I got that email, you see there, July 27th, I went to social media. I figured, the best way of presenting this data is presenting what everybody else thinks, not just what I think. Because I typically don't think of as myself as an expert. I think I typically consider myself as a resourceful person, trying to find information from other people who know it better. Okay, so I asked out to social media within these two groups, both of them, what would it take to bridge the gap between coders and CDI specialists? And the responses were great, and even the responses like the likes, the hearts, all of the emoji things that you respond back to on Facebook was great. And I based upon the participation and the engagement within the group, which ones were worthy to report in this presentation. So also I grouped some of the responses together because there was a lot of commonalities in the responses. So I grouped those as well. So let's start off with the first one. As I had mentioned before, there's a lot of tie-ins with my story, but I'm going to reiterate them here in the best practices. First best practice is learn from one another, right? That's one of the first things that come out. And this is Laura Copney, by the way. She is also a previous guest on a Not Also Classified podcast. I highly suggest you listen to that. She says coders should learn more about clinical documentation and disease processes and indicators, and CDI should learn coding guidelines. And knowledge alone is not enough. So you see the need here. It's not just CDIs who need to learn coding, but also medical coders. And I do this a lot in presentations, especially with the AAPC community, because they're mostly coders. And I say, you know what? Looking at a diagnosis documented and coding it just because it's documented is not enough. We have to, as medical coders, evolve ourselves to be better and look at the clinical indicators to see that it can truly support the diagnosis that you're reporting. And I have here Duard Venegas. In a perfect world, CDIs learn coding and medical and coders learn CDI. It is a, hopefully it's not really that easy, but that's the true end goal. Okay. The next one, as I did before in working with the medical coders, cross-train. Now, I don't know if this is a possibility within your facility, if you guys have the time. Of course, now with COVID, it may be difficult, but it's worth a try. It's worth a try. It may not be the whole team. Maybe one person could do it and kind of rotate along the way, or even the same way around. Coders can look into working at, cross-training into the inpatient process. Also the same way, medical coders can also look at the CDI process to get a better understanding of what the workflows are, so that way they know in passing through in terms of the revenue cycle management process, they understand both sides, so that way there's no issues along the way. This is Nikki Evans. She says she worked both at the same time. It was before CDI became what it was today. It was a trial run. She worked with a nurse and the CDI, they worked together. And so they were able to put together coding knowledge and nursing knowledge together in a common goal with working closely with doctors. Perfect combination. So if you put those combinations together, you have a better, I would like to say arsenal, not really arsenal, a big, not a defense either, but you just become out stronger with your practice. So that way you can improve documentation, and that is the goal. Next one is collaboration. And when I first started with CDI, the meetings were separate. Coders had their meeting, CDIs had their meeting. Why not just put it all together? And in this instance, Elise Natoli, she said they would do weekly, before COVID, weekly 30-minute weekly presentations with coders and CDI. 1 week was coding, 1 week was CDI, and they would have a group discussion, and they found that extremely helpful. But it depends. It depends on, and my response to that, it totally depends on what you're allowed to do, what you can do, the time constraints. For us, it was weekly CDI, and we brought in case study. Case studies always help out a lot with CDI's departments, but also we had, I think at the time, monthly coder and CDI to kind of identify the whole full spectrum. And if there was any issues that happened within the reconciliation process, that's where we would bring up those topics and discuss them thoroughly. So that way, again, the process would not be hindered. Okay. Next is open communication. Okay. Because we have email, we have text, it's very difficult to have open communication. It's to me, it's like now, after I had developed the coders relationship, I was able to just, I'm just going to send an email, and if I had any questions about the coding, I can go to one of the coders and I can reach out to them with any question. In the same regard, if they had any question about the CDI process, or because I was doing DRGs a lot, or even the query process, they would come to me and says, how would you approach this case? And we would do it, through open communication. So we have Donna and AJ Abram, both of them insisted that open communication is the key. Okay, I was fortunate to start my CDI career with a wonderful coder who started inpatient coding at the time. We didn't decide what was the right answers. It wasn't matter who was right or wrong, as long as we got it right. Coders and CDI make the absolute best team, bringing both perspectives into the mix. Open communication and a willingness to work together and learn from each other is the key. Next thing is respect. I think that's the one of the most one of the most fundamental aspects, one of the fundamental practices that we need to have. And this is Leanne Perry. Uh, Long story short, I was doing a presentation in Gainesville. She drove from Atlanta to see me to do an interview with me, and so her episode is called The Human Touch. I highly suggest you look that up. She's currently working as a CDI director, I think in Alabama right now. Anyways, she says mutual respect for each other's skill set, knowledge, and experience. I know we can have a battle, who has the most experience, who has the most credentials, who has the best exposure. But ultimately, I think what the real message here, and some of the terms that you may hear, is emotional intelligence. If we become humble and see past what we have done and come to a common goal, this wouldn't be a problem. Respect would not be a problem. That doesn't apply here, but of course it applies everywhere else. And then here, as I had mentioned before, it's kind of an ongoing topic. Is it's a team effort between providers. And I didn't talk about our relationship with CDI providers. I've actually did that with when I did the ACDIS conference in Orlando, the engagement between CDI and providers. But it takes an effort between providers, CDI, and coders. Once everyone realizes and accepts that accepts that the integrity of the medical record is the goal, then hopefully that gap will be bridged. Okay. And then lastly here, I have Lori Prescott. Of course, that is I'm sure you guys recognize her name. Of course, she works with ACDIS, and she chimed in. She actually chimed in. She's actually part of my CDI network group, and she said, "Great question. There should be no gap. There shouldn't be. There should be a clear delineation of the roles and the purpose, a CDI team that is well educated on the guidelines and coding conventions and clinics, joint educational opportunities, allowing each other to understand how they can support the other, a non-confrontational approach to the DRG reconciliation, allowing each other to learn from each other." And of course, she can talk hours on this subject. So maybe, hopefully, next time I could have her on the podcast and we can continue on with that conversation. So to expand a little bit here, some of the things that were not mentioned that I think is worth noting in terms of best practices is, because there is a gap, and anything that you do, there's no way to eliminate the gap. You could only reduce the gap. The same way I feel like you can't eliminate queries, but you surely can reduce them. Okay. But the best practice that I have is conflict resolution. And to bring it back full circle is, remember when I mentioned when the CDI consultants they proposed the CDI the CDI program to our facility, the initial taste in my mouth that, boy, there's going to be a lot of conflicts. And if that is expected with whatever process that you're going to do, you need to have a conflict resolution process. The same way that, of course, with CDI and physician engagement, there's going to be a conflict, right? So there needs to be there needs to be an escalation process for physician queries. The same way there is one, there should be an escalation process for reconciliation and CDI and medical coding. Okay, if there is a problem, we need to move it up to the manager, CDI manager, medical coding manager. After that, it needs to go up higher. So there needs to be a process in place to, if there's any issues that cannot be resolved, it's going to be resolved in the upper management. Also, another thing, especially when we're looking at data, and I saw Dr. Kennedy showing a lot of data in his presentation, we have to expand it. And then when I say expand it, okay, coding and CDI data should be somehow connected. Not connected in a way that is together, but it should flow. It should flow in a way that everybody in the process, everybody that is involved with that, should have an understanding of what it is. How does CDI involvement affect coding quality? Another question that you could ask is, how does CDI involvement affect the revenue process / denial process? So I know there's a lot of chatter on LinkedIn about the denial process. I know denials and clinical validation is a big topic with at least the social media LinkedIn community. That's just a big hot topic that everybody can talk about. But I asked the group, I asked my clinical documentation network group, and I asked, what does your denials management process look like in your CDI program, or just in general, maybe just within your program, your HIM program? I just put out a feeler. What are the struggles? What are your successes? Surprisingly, I'm not sure if this is, with everywhere else in the nation. So this is just within my group. The group is about, to give you some statistics, about 1.5 thousand, 1.500, I'm sorry, not thousand, 1.500 members. So this is what I got. And one of these members says, I don't know. I really would like to know about the denials and the appeals process. We are not privy to that information despite the request. So CDIs are truly interested in that process. But of course, the denial process, when you look at it, it traditionally falls on the medical coding side. And we had some consensus as well. I agree. Having information about the current denial and appeals process would enable us to be more proactive in CDI. Our CDI program specialists have no privy to that information. Our boss is of CDI and also the boss of utilization management also. So you see, because there's a gap, I think because there's a disconnected information, there's a disconnect in data. If you remove the disconnect from data, everybody is transparent, they're on the same page, they know what the one goal is, and they're able to do that, not just from a concurrent standpoint, also from a retrospective standpoint, but also a denial standpoint. We need to, as CDI, see the opportunity to do clinical documentation integrity in all aspects, concurrent, retrospective, and also the appeals and denial practice. So let me give you, I'm not going to go into it. Of course, I want to stay within the time. I'm going to give you a episode that I actually produced with Glenn Krause. By the way, there is an episode with him, actually two of them. And one of the second episode, which is called the Sequela with Glenn Krause, which was released this year, I mentioned about this. I mentioned the fact that shouldn't CDI be, expand their CDI metrics or their data to also include denials and appeals. I think if they actually tap into that, that can actually be a full circle and help them gain understanding what are some of the opportunities that they need to address with the physicians, look at their queries, because sometimes a query can lead to a denial, a really bad one, and I've seen a lot of them. So this is his podcast, Wiser Wednesday Experience Speaks. I was editing this episode this past weekend with Melissa Rodriguez. She's out in Oregon, and please listen to it because her practice of sharing data, CDI data, medical coding data, appeals and denials data with the whole team. To me, after I listened to that, I'm like, you know what? This has to be on this presentation. So please check that out. Wiser Wednesday Experience Speaks. So that is my time. You can check me out on LinkedIn. You could check out, of course, the Medical Coding Geek online too. You could check out Not Also Classified on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, most of the podcast platforms. Also the same way with the Wiser Wednesday Experience Speaks podcast. All right, so that is my time. Thank you guys very much for having me. Of course, if there are any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Brian. And if anybody has any questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can put it in the chat box and we will get it answered one way or the other.
Hey, Brian, this is Tracy, the gal that introduced you. Any quick thoughts on how to engage your coding team when they're offshore?
I didn't hear it. I'm sorry. Maybe you could
Not a
type the
problem. Can you
question.
hear me now?
Now I can hear
Brian,
you.
can you hear
Yes.
me now?
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So, do you have any quick thoughts about when your coding team is an offshore coding team
Oh,
and how to bridge the gap there?
you know, of course, I think, well, I could relate to this because, of course, with COVID, coronavirus, we all have to, we're doing this meeting on, Zoom came very popular. And I mentioned this before, is now we're doing video, right? And there are, the only suggestion that I have, because it's offshore, you have to step up your production game. The same way I have microphone, I have a audio mixer, I have a 1080p camera. And I used to teach, so teaching face to face and teaching online is totally different. But the best way to get your teams engaged, I think that's the key term, is engaged, is that you have to make the process that was on site available while it's off site. So you see here, I'm trying to up my production game, camera, microphone, and engaging through chat, answering questions. And the fact that during any presentation now, I would like to see the presenter, because I want to see the reactions. I want to, in the same way, I want to see the audience as well. The same thing when I do speaking events on site. I want to engage because I want to see. I totally miss, doing on-site speaking engagements. I wish I was up there. But the engagement factor online, that's what needs to be addressed.
Thank you so much.